What happens when a child asks the Pope a question no adult dares to speak aloud? During a quiet visit to the Vatican, Elon Musk's son X looked into Pope Francis's eyes and asked something about God that froze the garden in silence. The Pope answered, but his words felt like a farewell. The question is, to whom? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. Golden sunlight filtered through the leaves of the Vatican's private garden, casting long, gentle shadows across the cobbled path. It was a quiet afternoon. No crowds, no cameras, just peace. Elon Musk stepped through the narrow gate, not as a world-renowned innovator, but simply as a father. He walked in silence, hand in hand with his 5-year-old son, X. The boy clutched something small and crumpled in his free hand, a folded drawing, its edges worn from being held too tightly. A Vatican official gave a polite nod and motioned them forward. The gate behind them closed without a sound. Ahead, under the wide, patient branches of an olive tree, Pope Francis waited on a wooden bench. His white robe rippled slightly in the breeze. He looked older than Elon expected, more fragile maybe, but his eyes held a stillness that calmed the moment. Without hesitation, X let go of Elon's hand and ran forward before anyone could stop him. He stood before the Pope, tiny shoes pressed into the grass. "Are you God's friend?" he asked, voice clear and fearless. The Pope smiled softly. "I try to be," he replied, reaching out with open hands. X held up the folded drawing and placed it into the Pope's palm. For a moment, everything around them slowed. The air grew quiet, almost heavy, as the Pope opened the note. His eyes scanned it slowly. Then he closed them, holding the paper near his chest. He didn't speak. The silence felt full, sacred. Elon stood still, heart racing. He hadn't seen the drawing. He didn't know what his son had written. But something had changed. What was meant to be a polite visit now felt like something eternal. The Pope unfolded the drawing slowly, a simple image. Bold crayon lines, unsteady but clear. A door, shut, standing in the middle of white space. X looked up at him and said softly, "It's a door, but it's not open yet." Pope Francis smiled gently, lowering his eyes back to the paper. "And what do you think is behind it?" X didn't hesitate. "Maybe heaven, or maybe my grandpa." Elon stiffened. The word caught him off guard. His father hadn't come up in months, not in conversation, not in memories. The mention cut deeper than expected. The Pope looked at X for a long moment, then turned toward Elon, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes heaven isn't behind a door. Sometimes it's around us. In moments like this." X held the Pope's gaze. "I want to ask God something," he said quietly. Francis leaned in. "What would you ask him?" X moved closer, placed a hand near the Pope's shoulder and whispered into his ear. No one else heard. But Elon saw it, how the Pope's hand trembled slightly, how his eyes blinked once, deeply, like something had pierced through his soul. What did the boy say that made the Pope so still? For most of his life, Elon Musk had trusted in numbers, logic, and engineering over anything unseen. He built his empire on equations and systems, PayPal, Tesla, SpaceX, all crafted from late nights, tireless planning, and a relentless pursuit of progress. Faith? That was never part of the blueprint. If it couldn't be measured, modeled, or launched into orbit, it didn't belong in his world. Relationships often took a backseat to rockets. Conversations about the soul were replaced with code reviews. But then came X. Even from a young age, Elon's son asked questions that made no sense in a physics textbook. questions that stuck longer than they should have. "Does God get tired of listening?" he once asked from the backseat of a car. "Why are stars quiet?" he murmured as they looked through a telescope one evening. Elon often didn't know how to answer, and maybe that was the point. He remembered his own mother, sitting on a porch years ago, looking out at a South African sunset. "Even brilliant minds," she had said, "need a place to rest." Today, standing in the Vatican garden with his son, those words echoed louder than ever. Elon had come as a father, careful, curious, perhaps still skeptical. But his son? His son had come with something else entirely. A folded note, a drawing, a door. And now, as he watched Pope Francis listen with trembling hands to a whisper from a 5-year-old boy, Elon felt the shape of something deeper unfolding. Not a formula, not a strategy. Something spiritual, something sacred. And he realized something he hadn't before. Elon came with questions, but his son came with a mission. The tea room in the Vatican was silent but warm. The clink of porcelain cups had long faded, leaving only the ticking of an old wall clock and the soft rustle of curtains swaying in the Roman breeze. Elon sat across from Pope Francis, the table between them small but the space between their worlds vast. X, now quietly seated by the window, watched raindrops race each other down the glass. He held the Pope's rosary gently in his hands, as if it were made of starlight. Elon leaned forward slightly, voice low, almost uncertain. "Your Holiness, may I ask, what did he say to you?" The Pope took a breath, looked down at the cup in his hand, then met Elon's eyes. He asked if God ever gets lonely. Elon blinked, stunned. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came. Finally, he managed, "He's only 5. Francis smiled with the soft sorrow of someone who has seen too much of the world. "Yes," he said, "and already touching the heart of heaven." Elon exhaled slowly, running his fingers along the edge of the table. He glanced at his son again, now tracing the pattern of a raindrop with one small finger. "That's a heavy question," he muttered. "Children are lighter carriers of heavy truths," the Pope said. "They don't worry about being profound. They just speak what they feel." Then, as if moved by something deeper, the Pope reached into the pocket of his robe and slowly pulled out a small, aged rosary. "This was mine," he said, "from my first year as a priest. I have carried it through every joy and every sorrow, and now I want your son to have it." Francis walked over to X and knelt, his knees creaking, his hands steady despite the emotion behind them. "Here," he said gently. X accepted it with wide eyes, turning it over in his palms, as if unsure how something so small could feel so full. He looked up. "Will it open the door?" The Pope didn't smile this time. He simply whispered, "No, but it will help you wait for it to open." Elon stood still, his breath catching. He had designed bridges to Mars. He had built engines that pierced the sky. But at that moment, he wasn't a visionary or a billionaire. He was just a man, standing in front of a door he never knew existed, one his son had found, without blueprints, without instructions, just with a question. And suddenly, Elon wasn't staring at the Pope. He was staring at the child he had brought into the world. A child who had asked something no boardroom could answer. A child who had reached into the silence and somehow found God on the other side. And the door wasn't in heaven, it was within him. The Vatican quarters were still. Outside, Rome shimmered under a quiet midnight sky, its rooftops silvered by the soft glow of cloud-filtered moonlight. Elon stood alone on the small balcony, hands resting on the iron railing, eyes fixed on the ancient city below. He had paced for hours, The moment in the garden wouldn't leave him. The Pope's words echoed in his mind, but it was his son's question that wouldn't let him sleep. Who does God talk to when he's sad? It looped through his thoughts like a melody without end. Elon had built machines that outpaced thought, that touched the edge of space. But he had never built space for questions like this. His life had been noise, momentum, mission after mission. But now, everything was quiet. And in that quiet, something began to stir. Behind him, soft breaths broke the silence. X was fast asleep, curled up beneath white linens, one hand gently holding the rosary the Pope had given him. His tiny fingers wrapped around the beads with trust, not knowledge. Elon watched him for a long moment before returning to the balcony. He looked up at the stars, the ones he had studied, chased, even tried to reach. But tonight, they didn't look like goals, they looked like witnesses. He closed his eyes. Images rushed forward. Press conferences, launch countdowns, headlines, applause. But none of it filled the ache he hadn't known was there. A different kind of loneliness crept in, the kind not solved by brilliance or billions, the kind that came when you realized how many times you ignored the voice inside you because you were too busy proving something outside. A small voice broke through the stillness. "Dad?" Elon turned. X was sitting up, eyes barely open, hair tousled, the rosary still clutched in his hand. "Do you think God heard me?" Elon crossed the room slowly and sat beside him. He brushed a strand of hair from X's forehead and nodded. "Yeah, buddy, I think he hears you, louder than anyone." X looked down, but he didn't answer. Elon hesitated, then looked toward the window. "Maybe," he did. Maybe not with words. Maybe he answered with silence, or a rosary from a kind old man, or a dad staying awake, wondering. X was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay," he whispered. He lay back down, and within moments, sleep found him again. Elon remained sitting on the edge of the bed, one hand gently resting on the blanket. His mind, for once, wasn't racing. He wasn't solving. He wasn't planning. He was just there. With the weight of a question he didn't need to answer, just feel. That night, something shifted in Elon Musk. Not in his mind, not in his career, but somewhere deeper, somewhere quiet. And it didn't need words. The flight home was quiet. Elon and X sat side by side, the hum of the engines soft in the background. X gazed out the window, a small wrapped linen bundle resting in his lap, the rosary now a treasured keepsake. Before takeoff, a nun had approached their seats and handed Elon a sealed envelope. "From His Holiness," she said gently. "He asked that it be opened on the journey home." Elon hesitated, then passed it to X, who unsealed it carefully with his small fingers. Inside was a simple card, handwritten. No ornate signature, no formal titles. Just the voice of a man who had heard something sacred. Elon read it aloud, quietly. "Dear X, I may not have all the answers, but I do believe this. God speaks through little boys with big hearts. When you asked your question, I think He smiled. Don't stop asking. Francis." X didn't say much after that, but he held the card for the entire flight. Back in California, life resumed, but not quite as before. Elon went back to meetings, launch preparations, investor calls, but his rhythm had changed. He walked slower in the mornings, listened longer at bedtime. He didn't check his phone during breakfast anymore. And most of all, he watched his son, really watched him, with a kind of reverence he hadn't known before. One afternoon, a few weeks later, Elon was sitting in the sunroom when X came bouncing in, clutching a crumpled paper in both hands. "Dad," he said, breathless, "I drew the door again." Elon straightened. X unfolded the drawing carefully. This time the door was open, wide. Sunlight poured through in crayon beams, and beyond it stood a small bench. On that bench was a single figure. No face, just kind eyes drawn in soft lines. "You opened it?" Elon asked, voice low. X nodded. "Last night, in a dream." Elon felt a strange tightness in his chest. And what was behind it? X climbed into his lap, spreading the drawing between them. A man was sitting there. He didn't talk much. He just smiled. Did he say who he was? No, X replied softly. But I just knew. Elon looked at the picture again. The way the man was drawn, the bench, the warmth that radiated from the page. He could barely find his voice. "And how did you feel?" X leaned his head on his dad's shoulder. Elon closed his eyes. That single word did more to shake him than any headline ever had. He thought back to the Vatican garden, to the question that had pierced through years of noise. Does God ever get lonely? And now this dream, this drawing, this boy. The door hadn't opened in a dream. It had opened inside Elon. He wrapped his arms around X, holding him close. No questions, no answers. Just the warmth of being together. Just the miracle of feeling something he couldn't explain, but finally stopped trying to. It was late afternoon when the message arrived. Elon had just finished a conference call when his assistant handed him a small envelope marked with the Vatican seal. "It came through a private channel," she said. Elon opened it slowly. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note. For X, from His Holiness. He called for his son. "Hey, buddy, the Pope sent you something." X came running, the rosary still hanging from his neck like a badge of quiet courage. Elon inserted the drive and the screen lit up. There, in the soft glow of a modest Vatican room, sat Pope Francis. His voice was calm, his words carefully chosen. "Dear X, if one day you wonder why God is quiet, remember, silence is not absence. Silence is how He hugs the whole world at once. It means He's holding everything together, even you." The video faded to black. Elon didn't speak. He simply sat, eyes fixed on the blank screen, long after the message ended. A quiet tear rolled down his cheek, not from sadness, from something else, something softer, something holy. Later that evening, X returned to his crayons. He sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by scattered papers and colored pencils. Elon passed by his room and paused in the doorway. "What are you drawing now?" he asked gently. X held up the new picture. Another door. But this time it wasn't closed. It stood wide open. Light poured through, golden and warm. And standing in that light were three shapes. One was X. One was clearly the Pope with his white robe and kind eyes. And between them stood a third figure. No face, just a shimmer. Elon pointed. "And who's that?" X thought for a moment, then said, "I think it's God." "You didn't draw a face," Elon noticed softly. "I didn't need to," X replied. "I just know He's there." Elon sat beside him, the drawing between them. He studied the faceless shimmer, the way it seemed to radiate presence without shape. That's when he understood. Faith wasn't about seeing or knowing. It was about sensing, trusting, believing even when the picture wasn't complete. That night, Elon didn't search for answers. He didn't scan the skies or check data or try to reason anything into certainty. He simply sat in the stillness, watching his son hum softly as he colored, the room full of crayons and questions. God hadn't spoken in thunder, but in drawings, in silence, in the heart of a child who believed anyway. The sun had just begun to rise over the California hills when Elon sat alone in his study. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that asked nothing, demanded nothing, only presence. On his screen was a folder he had opened in secret. He called it The Door. Inside, he saved 3 files. The first was X's original drawing, the one he had clutched in his hand when they walked through the Vatican gates. The crumpled sketch of a closed door, childishly drawn in crayon, but heavy with meaning. The second was the handwritten letter from Pope Francis. The note X had opened on the plane, still folded neatly and smudged where tiny fingers had held it too tightly. The third file was a voice memo. Elon had recorded it late at night, alone, speaking softly into his phone like a confession. You reminded me that wonder is stronger than certainty, that love listens even in silence, and sometimes silence is God's answer. He saved the file, closed the folder, and sat back. Later that morning, a small linen-wrapped package arrived by courier. No stamp, no sender, only the Vatican seal embossed on the wax. Inside was a single olive leaf, dried, delicate, pressed perfectly flat, and a note. To my little friend, even a quiet question can echo across the world. In case you ever wonder if God is listening, remember, your voice already reached him. Francis. Elon held the leaf in his hand for a long time. Then he stood and walked to X's room. X was still asleep, curled under a blanket, the rosary from Rome looped around the bedpost. Carefully, Elon placed the small clear box with the olive leaf on a shelf near his son's bed. Beside it, he framed 2 drawings. The first, the original door, closed. The second, the door wide open, light pouring through. 3 figures standing in the glow. X, the Pope, and a faceless shimmer. Beneath the frames, Elon added a single engraved line. The door never really opens. We just stop being afraid to knock. He stepped back. No press release, no headlines, no explanation. With him just a father, quietly honoring a moment that changed him. And in the stillness, he realized some questions don't need answers. They just need to be held. That evening, the wind along the cliffs was soft and steady. The ocean below whispered like a lullaby, each wave folding into the rocks with quiet rhythm. Elon and X sat side by side, wrapped in a blanket, the sky painted in orange, lavender, and blue. The sun was slipping beneath the horizon, slow and gentle. X rested his head against his father's arm, legs pulled to his chest. He had the olive leaf with him, now tucked inside a small wooden box that he carried everywhere since their return. For a while, neither spoke. They just listened to the wind and watched the light change. Then X broke the silence. Do you think the Pope will remember me? Elon looked down at his son, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. I think he already does, he said softly. A lot. X nodded slowly. Then I want to remember him too. Another long pause. The kind of silence that felt like prayer. The waves kept moving. The sky kept shifting. But something about this moment was still sacred. Maybe faith wasn't thunder, or answers shouted from the heavens. Maybe it was this: 2 people, a question, a sunset, and the decision not to rush through any of it. So let me ask you something. When was the last time you sat with a question, not to solve it, but to feel it? When did you last allow yourself to wonder, not for certainty, but for connection? Sometimes the most powerful moments don't come with explanations. Sometimes they come with a whisper, a child's drawing, or a quiet walk beside someone who simply wants to understand the world with you. If this story stirred something inside you, don't rush past it. Hold it, let it breathe. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories of faith, wonder, and the quiet questions that change everything, subscribe now. Be part of something softer, something slower, something true. Because sometimes, the door doesn't need a key. It just needs a heart brave enough to knock.